When the real and the unreal meet, that for me is when the best fantasy happens. And so my story is set in a real location in a local Holloway here in West Dorset, one I know well, and one that is quite famous. And my story, which is called Hollowlands, starts with a quote from the poet W.B. Yeats from the Song of Wandering Angus, which goes something like this. Though I'm old with wandering through hilly lands and hollow lands, I will find out where she has gone and kiss her lips and take her hands. The old man stopped, breathing heavily as he leaned upon the horn handle of his favourite ash walking stick. The air in Holloway was close. The way the sheer sandstone sides pressed in and the elephantine beech trees loomed over made it slightly claustrophobic. And he pulled out a pressed silk handkerchief embroidered with a G, a gift from an aunt, to mop his brow. Grey Barrow, you old fool, he chided himself. You're getting too old for this game. His wheezy pipe smoker's rumblings seemed to be absorbed by the secluded fastness. A Holloway in deepest Dorset, only a couple of miles from the pleasant market town of Brightport. But it might as well have been darkest Peru, as his old crony mockingly referred to it when he told him of his intention to conduct another one of his exhaustive field trips. You and your Holloways, snorted Mellington at the ancient watering hole they haunted back in Oxford. How long have you been ploughing that furrow now, old chap? Since they chucked you out of academe, some would say it's an unhealthy obsession, that you're well and truly stuck in the proverbial rut. Ha! How the Academy had ridiculed his theories about the old trackways of Britain. Only Mellington had maintained a friendship, even at risk of his own academic respectability. A professor of experimental geography or some such. Somehow his old roommate from St. Alphonsus had maintained or managed to negotiate the tricky pathways of the system and was now part of the establishment himself, a minotaur in a labyrinth, as he would frame it. While as Greybarrow had been forced to self-fund his research once he was cast out, with watered-down WI lectures, workshops and walking tours. Somehow he scraped by, barely able to keep himself in tobacco and a pint of porter now and then, living in a squalid flat above a kebab shop, rammed to the ginnels with his research library, rare tomes, fragile pamphlets, manuscripts, xeroxes of articles, and other archival excretions from the outer limits of respectable systems of knowledge. From his canvas knapsack he took out a battered tin water bottle and slaked his thirst. It was a warm day in spring, and he was feeling distinctly overdressed in his usual rig, an elbow-patched tweed jacket, tellingly threadbare around the cuffs, pale blue flannel shirt, sage corduroy trousers tucked into rugby socks, and stout brogues. Upon his head even, sat his beloved battered fedora, sporting a pheasant feather. He was an anachronism in the modern age, and he knew it. Since that first encounter, he felt he had lived in a parallel England, not just ploughing his own furrow, but gone to ground, like the protagonist in Geoffrey Household's rogue male, who burrows into a Dorset Holloway to escape Nazi agents on his tail. And this, casting an appreciative glance round him, was said to be that very Holloway. It was indeed a most magnificent example of the landscape feature that had become his unfettered obsession over the last 3 decades. Hades Lane was one of the deepest and most distinctive. Its exposed rock walls festooned with an extraordinary palimpsest of petroglyphs, from the utterly prosaic roll call of names of local youths, smiley faces, and inevitable sexual organs, to sublime complicated patterns and green men and women, goblins, bogles, and dragons executed with a crude primal power. He had been here to hell and back many times, and each time he spotted a carving he didn't before, and failed to find ones he had. He never seemed to be It never seemed to be quite the same Holloway, as though the carvings were in fact an Appalachian cranky and quietly rolled about when no one was around. He took out his trusty Sony to film it, offering a commentary. So it's the 29th of April, and I'm back in Hades Lane, Dorset, also known as the Devil's Drongway. This is an iconic example of a Holloway. Nowhere else has such distinctive carvings. The sandstone makes it possible, of course, but when did this tradition start? The 80s? Victorian times? The Neolithic? I'm thinking of the remarkable graffiti at Stonehenge, from modern vandals to the likes of John Keats and Sir Christopher Wren, but also going back to the daggers and axes of the Bronze Age. We are compelled to leave our mark, to say, I was here. And yet this place is so much more than a canvas for local vanity. It is a portal. As I'm convinced the oldest Holloways are, not all, mind you, but some offer access to the Hollow Lands. The crack of a twig made Greybarrow start, and nearby nearly dropped the camera. Fortunately, he had his strap around his wrist, but he stopped filming for a moment, a bit shaken. He scanned his surroundings, but the Holloway was empty and the tree line still too threadbare from last winter to hide anyone. Nevertheless, he found himself calling out, "Hello! Anybody there?" He suddenly felt a bit embarrassed at the thought of someone eavesdropping upon his monologue. He posted his videos on his YouTube channel, Hollow Wayfarer, but Greybarrow had become very prickly around people, sensitive of mockery after a lifetime of having the piss taken out of him by ex-colleagues in the department, old school friends, neighbours, the local youths. It seemed the world in general mocked Greybarrow, finding his English eccentricity less charming, more pitiful. He lacked the charisma to make his quirks and peccadillos appealing. It didn't help he got easily irritated, finding most people insufferable. There were only a few kindred spirits he had connected with through social media who seemed to get him. But most of them he had never met, and so it was a rather hollow kind of friendship. But that summed up his life perfectly. He had done his best to fill the vacuum of existence with stuff, books, vinyl, odd knickknacks. Clutter, his sister called it, unable to spend more than 5 minutes in his flat because she found it smothering, stinking of his fusty maleness, pipe smoke, booze, the congealed remains of a fry-up and drying laundry. Your life needs a good spring clean, she had nagged, but he was the archetypal bachelor, more set in his ways than a fucking badger. You're going to end up one of those people they find dead in a flat months or years after you've snuffed it, his sister warned the last time he saw her. This niggled him. If he was to kick the bucket in an untimely manner, and when was it ever timely, then he hoped it would be in a Holloway. That would have poetry to it. He died doing what he loved. Could be trotted out as a memorial along with all the usual cliches. But right now, he didn't want to pop his clogs. His heart was going 9 to the dozen. Classic case of panic, dear boy, he murmured to himself. The great god Pan must be near. He licked his lips suddenly dry as he rewound his mental VCR to the inciting incident, to that first encounter. He had been on an Easter break to blow away the cobwebs after an intense term, one when he had started to feel like he wasn't cut out for the game of academe. All of his peers seemed to be born to it, while he, the scholarship boy from the northern Cinque Estate, always seemed to be the odd one out, just about scraping by. He hadn't been born with any of the privilege, any of the cultural priming. He was graceless, clueless, lacking in social graces and the know, that tacit body of knowledge that only a certain set seems privy to. Unable to interpret their codes, he created his own secret world. He had become obsessed with old straight tracks, holloways, droveways, saltways, and corpse paths, the etymology of lost lanes, glimpses of ancient stories hiding in plain sight. He had written a paper on herepaths, the military tracks created by Alfred the Great, which still could be spotted on old maps in place names. He had won him some kudos, but when he started to connect this with ley lines, earthlights, folklore, and phenomena, he went beyond the pale. And it had been that Easter when it had happened, the turning point. He had been lost in a Holloway, somewhere on the Welsh borders, one whose etymology intrigued him. He was convinced its name, of which there were many variants, derived from Tyluoth Teg, the Welsh fairies, or themselves, the good neighbours, the people of peace, the crew that never rest. Because you should never refer to them directly by name, he interpreted it as the track the shining ones. It had been late in the afternoon, the sun was about to set, and an imminence filled the air worthy of an Arthur Machen story. As though in hushed anticipation everything became quieter and more intense, as though the veil of the world was about to be rent asunder. And then he had seen her. The glimmering girl in the gloaming, fey and beautiful, in a gossamer dress, more a halo of effulgence than any kind of mundane fabric. She had looked at him with eyes that contained a coalescence of colours, swirling nebulae of potentiality which called to him DNA to DNA. It seemed Greybarrow in that moment that he was glimpsing a portal to another world, the hollow lands within the world, not the hollow earth in the sense of Jules Verne, but the true earth, its quintessence, when all that was superficial had been stripped away. And then she had laughed and ran, fading in the brightening air, just as Yeats had put it, describing wandering Angus's encounter with his own glimmering girl. And after that, Greybarrow had dedicated his life to finding her again, searching through hollow lands and hilly lands, reaching beyond the academic pale for clues and answers, and thus exiling himself from its fusty purview. And here he was, old with wandering, balding, beer-bellied, and stiff-jointed with a smoker's cough, a sad old man searching for the lost magic of his glory days, when he still felt like he had a pulse and potential, a future of possibilities rather than one that narrowed daily, a living example of the law of diminishing returns. Breaking out of his fug, Greybarrow continued up the steep track. He kept the camera running as he ventured further up the holloway, scanning the carvings slowly, zooming in now and then on one of particular note. The sun was low and making the sandstone glow as it filtered through the tree line, dappling everything in a golden light. It was at times like this Greybarrow could say with absolute certainty that he was happy. No people, no judgments, just himself and his passion, his research. That was all that mattered. He had meticulously visited, catalogued, and recorded every holloway in the United Kingdom. His archive of recordings and photographs were the envy of his peers. His sister might ask, yes, but what is it all for? In that irritating way of hers, but Greybarrow believed in knowledge for knowledge's sake. True, he had been working on his grand thesis about the significance of holloways for years, but there was always something more to research, another reference to follow up. Clues hidden in local history sections of provincial libraries, newspaper cuttings, or amongst the dead ends and false grails of social media. One day he would publish his magnum opus, and then the world would realize the magnitude of his discovery. Greybarrow's heart quickened as he reflected on how close he was to the final breakthrough. He could feel it in his bones. The questing beast he had been pursuing for decades, he was finally running it to ground. Absorbed in the view he was capturing, Greybarrow didn't realize he walked towards some brambles spilling over from the embankment until one snatched his hat from his head. What the? He turned around, momentarily confused, until he saw his hat hanging from the bramble. Cursing, he reached up to grab it, but it swayed out of his reach.